Hey there. Welcome to the Tech Tuesdays webinar on the Introduction to Databricks and Informatica Data Engineering Integration. Today's presenter will be Stein Carrion, Associate Staff Engineer from Informatica GCS. He's been with Informatica for over 11 years and supports data engineering products in the EMEA region. Before we get started, here are some housekeeping tips. Today's webinar is scheduled for 1 hour, including the Q&A section. The session will include a webcast, and then your questions will be answered live at the end of the presentation. All dial-in participants will be muted to enable the speakers to present without interruption. Your questions can be submitted through the Q&A section, and we'll be addressing them to the end of the presentation. The webinars will be recorded and will be available in the Informatica Support YouTube channel and the Success portal. The link will be emailed to you as well. Please set aside some time to complete the post-webinar survey and provide your feedback and suggestions for upcoming topics for the Tech Tuesday webinars.
Thank you for the introduction, Vrinda. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome once again to this Tech Tuesdays webinar by Informatica Global Customer Support. My name is Stein Carrion, and I am one of the support engineers based out of EMEA. So for the next 40 minutes or so, we'll be talking about Databricks and how Informatica data engineering can integrate with Databricks. So we'll go through some slides, have a demo to have a bit more of a hands-on look on things, and we will finish off this session with some Q&A at the end. Let's have a quick look at the agenda. We'll start talking about Databricks, what Databricks is exactly and where it sits in the whole Hadoop and big data landscape. We'll talk about the data lake, the Delta Lake option, which is offered by Databricks and how we can integrate with it. And then most of the time we'll be talking about how you actually can set up your existing Informatica data engineering installation to work with Databricks and pull or write data to the Delta Lake. In the demo, we'll be illustrating most of the steps that we'll be discussing. We'll be providing some details as to how you can troubleshoot some of the more common issues. And as before, we'll close the session with a Q&A. So let's talk about Databricks. If you look at the whole, let's say, big data technology landscape, it is something that has been evolving over the years that it's been around. Quite a few of you who have been working with big data and Hadoop for a long time now might remember the days that you had to just get the Apache project yourself, build everything, make sure you had a HDFS layer, a Hive layer, your MapReduce framework all set up from scratch. So that's kind of where we are all the way at the left of this slide. And we moved then off to the more, let's say, enterprise distributions where you had Cloudera and Hortonworks coming in as the main big players. And back in the day, everything was still very much focused on on-premise installations, which was causing quite a lot of overhead in terms of administration and footprint for organizations. So we from Informatica and also in the wider field, we saw a move towards hosted deployments, where the whole Cloudera or the whole Hortonworks installation would be installed in cloud platforms. And now more and more we are actually seeing full cloud deployments. We're talking about HD Insight, EMR clusters, and now more and more also serverless deployments, which is where Databricks is sitting really. because Databricks as such isn't a Hadoop cluster, it is a Spark cluster where you can process your workload without having the whole complexity of the underlying HDFS layer as well. So what is Databricks? Databricks is a company that was founded by the creators of Apache Spark, and we're talking about late 2013 when the company was founded. So even today, the main founders of Spark are still working for Databricks, and they are actually still one of the main contributors of the open source Apache Spark project as well. So Databricks today, we are looking at a cloud or web-based platform where you can work with Spark, and it will provide you an automated cluster management. So you basically can create a Spark cluster in a few clicks. It's available on Azure and AWS as a service, so it's nicely integrated with the whole Azure and AWS ecosystem. And throughout this presentation and later on in the demo, you'll mostly see references to the Azure implementation, but the whole implementation on AWS, the interface and all that is very similar. So you should be able to refer to the slides even for implementing this on AWS. So as I said before, you can create a Spark cluster with just a few clicks. And the good thing as well is that Databricks can auto-scale your cluster depending on what kind of jobs you are running. So you can, on demand or automatically, you can increase the amount of nodes which are processing as part of your cluster, and you can also decrease it just to keep the costs down. So if we have a look at the whole workspace, the Databricks platform, you have on the top left, you have notebooks and dashboards which are available for you. So notebooks are pretty much web-based interfaces where you can run code, you can run SQL directly on your Delta Lake, and it gives you some visualization of your data, for which you will move on to the dashboards, where you can publish graphs and visualizations and share them in a presentation format within your organization. Now, what we are mostly interested in, of course, is the middle part here, which is the orchestrated Apache Spark in the cloud, where we'll actually do all our Spark processing. In terms of storage layer, you'll mostly see that Databricks will connect with your existing cloud storage. So we're talking about ADLS Gen 1 or ADLS Gen 2 or Amazon S3, a storage layer where you will store your data. So let's just very briefly talk about this screenshot, which illustrates on how you create a cluster in Databricks, but we'll get back to this in more detail in the demo. So in Azure, as soon as you've got your Databricks workspace set up, you can, with this form, create your cluster. It's very straightforward, as you can see. It's just a small form where you select the version, the kind of cluster, how many nodes you want to be dedicated to this cluster, whether you want it to auto scale, so spin up workers as you need to handle your workload and spin them back down again if there's less workload. And you can also configure the cluster to automatically terminate if there is no activity anymore, saving costs obviously on the cloud resources that you are running. So that's a very quick overview on Databricks, what Databricks is. And now we'll just talk a bit more about Delta Lake, which is a small additional topic, because we're not talking about the processing layer as such here. Because Databricks Delta Lake is actually a data access layer which sits on your existing data lake. That could be HDFS, but most of the time, again, we are talking about cloud storage. So you might have your data lake sitting on ADLS Gen 1 or ADLS Gen 2, and your Delta Lake will be sitting on top of that. Now, what is the main advantage of the Delta Lake? The Delta Lake is giving you ACID transactions to your data lakes. So you can go and update data, you can cleanse data, and you will be keeping history of all of your data lake. So you can roll back to previous versions of your data, you can get back to a previous snapshot of your data, and the way that that is being done is that any changes on the data in your Delta Lake are being written to a transaction log. So rather than modifying the files, everything is kept into a transaction log. And then by making use of the computing power of Spark on the Databricks cluster, which will be linked to your Delta Lake, you can easily go back in time and look at snapshots of your data at one moment in time. So Delta Lake is actually, again, all open source, and the data in your Delta Lake is stored in Apache Parquet files. So nothing unusual there. It's just the combination here of the processing power of your Databricks cluster, which is being used here to give that additional ACID level to data lakes. This is a very short overview of how Delta Lake sees data lakes. So you've got your existing data lake at the bottom, which might be HDFS or S3 or any other kind of cloud storage. And your Delta Lake kind of has three zones. You've got your bronze layer, which is where you raw data sits in the native format. Then you get your silver tables, silver refined tables, which is sanitized data, some cleansed data. After which you will move to the gold stage, which is the data that is accessed via the Delta Lake itself, and which then can be pushed to your data warehouse depending on the business requirements. So that is, in a nutshell, Databricks and Databricks Delta Lake. So let's go and have a look now as to how we can get Informatica to work with Databricks. So we will be talking about Informatica 10.4 during this presentation. So Informatica 10.4 was released in December 2019. And introduced the full support for Databricks pushdown as well as Delta. Databricks pushdown was also available in earlier versions, 10.2.2 hotfix 1. But for any new implementations, we would strongly recommend that you use the latest available Informatica 10.4 release, which as of the 28th of February, so just 2 weeks ago, is 10.4.01. Which would be the recommended release for all Informatica data engineering installations. In terms of what's on the horizon for new releases, we will have 10.4.02, which is scheduled for release in April 2020, and we've got 10.4.1, which is scheduled for release in June 2020. As always, any dates are subject to change. So if you want to confirm dates close to the time, please get in touch with one of the support engineers. Currently, Informatica 10.4.x supports Databricks 5.5. So you need to make sure that any Databricks cluster you are working with uses that version. For reference, included a link to the whole 10.4 documentation set for the data engineering product line. So a quick overview of what kind of sources and targets we can connect to. in the Databricks when you are basically pushing down a mapping to the Databricks cluster. So we can connect to a variety of JDBC sources and targets using a JDBC v2 connector. Now the JDBC v2 connector is a new connector that was introduced in 10.4. So it's an evolved, an improved version of the JDBC connector, which you might have been using in previous releases. But yeah, in order to access any relational databases with 10.4 on Databricks, you will need to use the JDBC v2 connector. We also support Snowflake. We've got Azure, Blob, ADLS Gen 1, Gen 2, and S3, on which you can have files, so be it simple flat files, CSV files, as well as Avro, Parquet, and JSON. Then additionally, we have Azure Cosmos DB, Azure DW, and Events Hubs, and we have AWS Redshift. So those are all the sources and targets you will be able to use in your data engineering mappings that you want to run on a Databricks environment. For a full overview of the PAM, just follow this link where you get all the details on what is supported for the 10.4 release. So what kind of products are integrating with Databricks? What kind of Informatica products are integrating with Databricks? So we have 3 layers of integration. We've got what we call the data science lifecycle, where you're talking about products like the Enterprise Data Catalog and upcoming enterprise data preparation as well. It's not available today yet. We have data ingestion, which could be done using our IICS, Intelligent Cloud Services platform, as well as the data engineering side of things, which is the data engineering integration, which we will be talking about today. So all of the interaction with Databricks is either happening through REST APIs or using the Databricks JDBC connector. So let's have a look at how the Informatica data engineering installation is communicating with the Databricks environment. So this diagram is showing the workflow of executing a mapping, be it from within your developer or executing a mapping from an application as to how it gets executed on the Databricks cluster. So on the left-hand side, you can see what's happening on your Informatica server, so on your data integration service. And on the right-hand side, you see what is happening in the Databricks environment. So first of all, your LDTM will be translating the mapping into Scala code. It will be packaged as an application, and it will be sent to the Databricks engine executor on the data integration service machine. So for those of you who are familiar with data engineering integration and are already pushing down mappings in Spark mode to any of your existing Hadoop clusters, the Scala code that you will see generated in this case is very similar, if not identical, because you are still using Spark here as an execution engine on Databricks. So as soon as this is translated, our Databricks engine executor will be submitting the application through a REST API to the Databricks cluster. And at that point, that the application gets requested to be run, and it will be staging files as well for runtime. So again here, just like in a traditional Hadoop scenario, Informatica will be pushing down some binaries to the Databricks cluster in order to be able to run the Informatica mappings on the cluster. As soon as we then are on the Databricks cluster, the Databricks cluster will pass the request to the Databricks Spark driver on the driver node, and that will then distribute the job on one or more Spark executors, which will be running on the worker nodes. So that is pretty much how mapping gets executed and translated from a normal Informatica mapping up to a Spark job running on all of the nodes in the Databricks cluster. So what do we need to do in order to get to this point? So how do we configure Informatica data engineering to run these mappings on Databricks? As we are integrating with the third party, there are two sets of requirements. So we need to make sure things are fine on the Informatica side as well as on the Databricks side. So starting off, this is a small flow which is taken from the integration guide. So you can refer to that, which has more details. So we need to make sure that our Informatica installation meets the system requirements for the domain installation. We need to make sure that our Databricks environment is supported, meaning we make sure we are using a Databricks 5.5 instance. In terms of configuration cluster side, Databricks side, we need to configure preemption for concurrent jobs. This is to make sure that our jobs can execute in a timely manner and they do not get executed, they do not get terminated while waiting for resources. We need to configure the storage access, which is, again, a generic way from the Databricks perspective to connect to your cloud storage. There are some staging directories to create where the Spark mappings will stage data. And in order to authenticate, we are using the token authentication. So in Databricks, we will be creating tokens. Those tokens will be configured on the data integration service side, and that is used to establish the connection between the Informatica data integration service and the Databricks cluster. So on the Informatica side, we will be creating a cluster configuration object, CCO, which is again very similar to any traditional Hadoop distribution. And based on that CCO, we will be creating a Databricks connection. And it's that Databricks connection object which will be associated to your mappings in order to push down the mapping to the Databricks cluster. These are just two screenshots from the Databricks configuration side. So on the left-hand side, you can see that in the advanced options of your Databricks cluster, you can provide Spark configuration properties. In this example here, you can see the required properties to associate your Databricks cluster with an ADLS Gen 2 account. Obviously, the keys and secrets have been blanked out here. So all of the supported storage solutions that are available with Informatica Data Engineering are documented, because obviously for ADLS Gen 1 or for WASB or for S3, you will have a different set of properties to configure on your Databricks cluster. On the right-hand side, you can see the screenshot of the dialog in Databricks where you can generate tokens. So that's the token that will be used on the Informatica side to connect to the Databricks environment. So from the Informatica side, you will be creating your CCO, your cluster configuration object, where you are referring to the Databricks domain, and then you will be providing a token ID and a cluster ID, which I'll show in the demo where to receive that information from. Once you've got your CCO, you will also have a connection object that is being created, and that is then the connection, as in the lower screenshot, that is being associated with your mapping, and obviously you need to change your validation and execution environment to put Databricks in order to be able to run on the Databricks cluster. Then just one additional slide regarding the data engineering cloud provisioning configuration. So for those of you who have been working with cloud-based clusters already, you will know about create cluster tasks and delete cluster tasks, which are available in Informatica workflows. These tasks allow you to create ephemeral clusters. What does that mean? It allows you to create a cluster, a computing cluster, and tear it back down again on the fly. So this gives you the added benefit of not having a cluster running all the time. So for any jobs that are running here, the create cluster task, which is the first one in the workflow, will connect to your cloud ecosystem, and through the API, it will create a cluster based on the specification that you've provided. As soon as that cluster is up and running, which in a typical Databricks environment is a matter of a few minutes, the workflow will proceed and push down the mapping to the cluster that just has been created. And upon mapping completion, the cluster will automatically be deleted again on the cloud, on your cloud instance. Again, I'll come back to this in the demo, just to go a bit more in depth as to what needs to be configured for that. That was it in terms of how to configure Databricks as an execution environment for Informatica data engineering. Moving on now to how we can source or write data to Databricks Delta. So the connectivity to Databricks Delta is established using the Databricks Spark JDBC driver. So you can see there's a clickable link there which will take you to the Databricks page where you can download the Spark JDBC driver. JDBC driver, like any other JDBC driver, needs to be copied to your external JDBC jars directory on the server as well as on the client. On the server, that will need data integration service restart, and on the client, you will need to restart the developer client in order for the new Spark JDBC driver to be picked up. So using that driver, we will be able to read and write from or to the Delta Lake. You do need to note that writing to the Delta Lake is only supported when you have a mapping running in the Databricks engine. If you try and write to Databricks Delta Lake in native mode, you'll see that the data ends up as NULL in your Delta Lake tables, which is obviously not what you would want. We are able to create Delta Lake tables on the fly as well. So you can just create your mapping and let the mapping take care of the creation of your Delta Lake tables as it's running. So just a quick overview on the connection details. So the connection string is something you can retrieve from your Databricks workspace. I'll show you where you can find that URL. And again, just like with the Databricks execution engine integration, the authentication here is done by using a token, which is done by specifying token as the username and then copying across the actual token as the password for your connection. And if you want Informatica to take care of the creation of your Delta tables, you can just tick the target schema strategy here on the screenshot to say create or replace the table at runtime. So that's it in terms of slides. So we'll be moving on to the demo now. So what we'll look at in the demo is we'll have a quick look at the Databricks workspace, showing how to create a cluster, where you can find the cluster ID, how you configure storage, and how you can create tokens. We'll move on to the Informatica side. We'll take a look how you create your CCO, how you create the connections, and how you actually run a mapping in Databricks. I'll also be showing the automatic cluster creation, which we discussed about creating and deleting workflows, creating and deleting clusters from a workflow. And we'll also have a quick look at connecting to Databricks Delta. So let's move out of the presentation and have a look at a demo now. So as I said at the very beginning, we'll be looking at the demo in Azure. So as you can see, this is the Azure portal where I have previously created my Databricks workspace. So this is then the Databricks workspace where you have all the components of the Databricks platform available to you in the web UI. As we said, we've got notebooks where you can create either scripts, Python in Scala, SQL, or R. But what we will be looking at in more detail now is at the cluster setup. So we can, okay, so we got a cluster which I've created previously. Actually, I can show you how to create a cluster, which is just create cluster. You have your name, you provide the mode, the version. Just be aware we are supporting 5.5 at the moment. You can configure or disable your auto scaling. When you have auto scaling, your cluster will automatically grow and shrink between the minimum and maximum worker nodes. You can also specify what kind of node you want to use for each for your worker nodes. So this example, we just use the standard one. Okay, let's just move out of here and have a look at my existing cluster. So my existing cluster is running at the moment. I have configured this one to link to my ADLS account, ADLS Gen 2 account. So that is where my storage layer is. And so that's basically it in terms of having a cluster, a Databricks cluster running. Now, how do we connect to this from our Informatica data engineering platform? So let's go and have a look. The first thing you would want to do is you want to go and create a cluster configuration object. Just have a look at the information you need. So just in order to create a CCO, we can directly import from the Databricks cluster. The information you need to provide is your Databricks domain, which you can get just from the URL there. So that's, in my case, westeurope.azuredatabricks.net. You need your, let's go with this one first, the cluster ID. Cluster ID is available in your advanced option tags. You've got cluster ID. It's this one, or it's actually also available again in the URL. It's this part of the URL here. So you need to provide that in the Databricks cluster ID of your cluster configuration object. Token ID will be used for authentication. Now, how do you create a token, a new token? So you go to your profile, user settings, where you can create a new token for authentication in the API. You just put a comment and then click generate. It will generate you a token which you copy over here. So once you've created the cluster configuration object, you will also automatically create a Hadoop connection for you, which will then be used to associate your mappings with the Databricks environment. So let's move on to the developer, where we have a mapping ready. So this is a mapping reading from ADLS Gen 2 and writing to the Databricks Delta Lake. So let's just move into the Delta Lake now, since we are writing to that in the mapping. And let's have a look at the Delta Lake connection. So the Delta Lake connection is just a regular JDBC connection where you provide the Spark driver. So the Spark driver, as we discussed, can be downloaded from the Databricks site and needs to be copied in your external JDBC jars for your client and the equivalent directory on the server. So once you have that in place, you put in your class name, connection string. The connection string is again available for you in your Databricks workspace. So let's have a look where we find that. Go up to your cluster, advanced option, JDBC ODBC, and you can copy the URL. Actually, you only need it up to here because token and the token details can be set directly in the Informatica connection. So you copy the URL, you specify token as the username, and then as the actual password, you copy the token which you would have copied across from the Databricks site. As soon as you've entered all the information, you can test your connection. So metadata connection successful. And once you've got this connection in place, it just functions like any other relational connection. So for instance, you can browse relational data object, Delta. You can browse any tables that are available in the Delta Lake directly from developer as well. So just got one table here, just showing you that it's available for you here, and you can directly import it. So this mapping, obviously, if this was a standard Hadoop push-down mapping, you would have either selected Blaze or Spark in your existing environments. Now to push down to Databricks, we just need to make sure we select the Databricks environment, both in the execution environment and the validation environment, and we associate it with our Databricks connection that we have created. Just to show you the execution plan. So this is the Scala code that will get generated by Informatica to run the mapping on the cluster. So I'm going to run this mapping. So as soon as we run the mapping, we can go back to our administrator. Let's go to monitor, ad hoc jobs. See, this mapping is running now, and we can directly see from here that we have now a Databricks application. So the mapping log is similar to any other mapping. What you will have now is you will have a log, a link to the logs on the Databricks cluster, which you can follow. It brings you to the job that is running. So this is now running on my existing cluster, which was created previously. To avoid confusion, let me just, okay. So here you can monitor the application. You can go and check the log files as and when needed. Just take a few minutes to complete. Wait. As you see, there's nothing much different from a regular Hadoop push-down mapping here. So let's just keep an eye on it here in our progress bar. Oh, there we go. It's just succeeded now. So that mapping has executed successfully on Databricks. Now, we were talking earlier on as well about automatically creating and deleting clusters, which is possible in Databricks. So let's have a look at how to achieve that. So we'll start off again in the administrator, where you would now have a new type of connection, which is an auto provision connection, where we specify the type of cluster we want to go and use, and we associate that with our Azure account. Now, once we have that in our workflow, so this is a workflow where you can see you've got a create task, create cluster task, and a delete cluster task. So in the create cluster task, we associate our auto provision connection, which is linked to our Azure Databricks account. And then, just like if you were creating the Databricks connection, sorry, Databricks cluster from the Azure Databricks workspace, at this level, you pretty much have the same kind of options of which kind of nodes, how many nodes you want to use. Do you want to use auto scaling or not? So this information will be used to create the cluster for you on the fly. And obviously the delete cluster task will just do the opposite. It will then tear down the cluster as soon as the mapping is finished. So let's go back to my mapping, where previously I had specifically, enable Databricks again. Yeah, so I was here directly pointing to my Databricks connection. So what I want to do now, if I want my my cluster that's being created on demand to be used, I'm going to select auto deploy. Save that. And they got the workflow. So I'm just going to redeploy my application that contains my workflow. And then we're going to we're going to run that workflow, and we'll see the cluster being created on the fly on the Databricks side. Let's just run that. Okay, so let's go and monitor our workflow. There we go, that's just come up. So obviously the first step in the workflow is our create cluster task, which is going to create the new Databricks cluster in our account. So let's go and have a look over here. We should now, in a few seconds, see that the cluster is being created as we speak. So this will obviously take a few minutes. I'm not sure if we'll be able to see the whole process here. But yeah, in your workflow, the cluster is being created. And actually, let me open up one of my previous runs. You can see that the cluster got created, after which the mapping is running, and the cluster gets deleted again. So this DEI on-demand cluster, which I've created here, will just exist for the lifetime of my workflow. As soon as it has created the mapping, it will be deleted again. And if you would come back here in 5-6 minutes, this cluster would no longer be visible. I would only have your test cluster, which was my pre-created cluster, still running there. So I think that pretty much concludes what I wanted to show in the demo. Yeah, we won't have enough time to see this whole process of creation and deletion complete, because we want to keep some time for some Q&A at the end. So let's just move back and do the presentation and conclude the last few details here. We've gathered some links here which can help you in troubleshoot some common issues and also enable you to create mappings and run mappings on Databricks. So first off, as always, our Informatica HQL how-to library and knowledge base contain a wealth of information. We've got specific H2L documents created on how to integrate Databricks and Delta Lake on both Azure and AWS platform. So those two documents contain step-by-step information of everything you need to configure. So it goes a bit more in depth as what I've been able to show you here. A few links to some KB articles, which might be some issues that you might face while getting to work with Databricks. For instance, the first one discusses as to why you potentially might be failing connectivity issues to Databricks Delta, and that is mostly because Databricks clusters typically will be configured to shut down after a certain amount of idle time. And if you try to connect to Databricks Delta Lake while the cluster is idle, the first connection attempt will actually be spinning up your cluster again. So you need to wait a few minutes before you can actually connect, because you need to give it some time for the cluster to come online again. It also discusses some additional debug tracing that you can add for the JDBC driver, and how to create the CCO for Databricks using the command line. Obviously, I've only shown the process in the administrator, but you can achieve the same with the command line. We've got some very good video KBs. These have been created by one of my colleagues, Puneet, who also gives a more detailed demo on all the aspects that we've discussed in this webinar. So for references, yeah, just check the H2L documents and the official data integration guide, which has all the required information to get you started with Databricks. So with that being said, I think we can move over to the Q&A now. So any questions from the people of the call, you can just put them in the Q&A box and we can just run through them here. Don't think there's any at the moment, so let's just give it some time and see if anything comes in. Otherwise, we will just conclude this session. One question that just came in: does Databricks have AD integration? So yes, since Databricks, at least from an Azure point of view, if you deploy Databricks on Azure, Databricks is completely integrated with your Azure environment. So yes, you can integrate Databricks with the Azure Active Directory. Other question: on what circumstance do we require an on-demand cluster? It depends on use cases. Obviously, if you have a mapping that is only running a few seconds and you have a cluster in your organization that's already up and running, you might just want to use that cluster all the time. However, if you have a job which is going to run for a specific amount of time, and you don't have too much else happening in the Databricks side of things, then it might make sense just to spin up a cluster and only have it live and obviously only pay for it for the time of your processing. So if you do, let's say, a weekly batch and that's the only thing you do on Databricks, there's no point in keeping your Databricks cluster ready to go for nothing else really. So it would really be for smaller jobs where you just run once a week or just occasionally, and you want to keep your costs down. Do we have this recorded? Yes. So this session has been recorded and will be posted out, as I believe, on the Success portal, as well as on the YouTube channel, on the Informatica GCS YouTube channel.
on-demand cluster is just to support the process. So the on-demand cluster is really where you don't have a cluster created directly in Databricks, but you let the workflow take care of creating the cluster for your processing. Is this data integration for big data quality, as we currently are using version 10.2 hotfix 1 SP1? So what we've been talking about is actually Informatica 10.4. We are mostly looking at data engineering integration, which is obviously the new naming for the big data product line. So big data quality would now be called data engineering quality. We don't have the support for the DEQ transformations as we have them for Hadoop pushdown at the moment. That is on the roadmap. So currently you would be looking at data engineering integration and also data engineering streaming. We do support streaming as well on Databricks. Are there any further questions? Okay, there's a few more coming. So how does the ad hoc cluster creation work when we have multiple pipelines running without overcoming the number of cores available for subscription? That one, a number of cores, and it depends, are you talking about number of cores on your Databricks side or on the Informatica side? So, I mean, you would obviously, within a workflow, you can have multiple pipelines, so you can have multiple mappings in between you create cluster and your delete cluster task. So I'm not sure at what level you're talking about the cores available. So anything else is going in? Question, token authentication. So yes, token authentication is what we are using now. So you are using the token that you generate on the Databricks side, and that is what you use to connect to with your cluster configuration object, as well as similarly for the Delta Lake, where you connect through the JDBC connection. There's also a question about authenticating to Databricks with Kerberos. So that is not something that is supported at the moment. I believe it's on the roadmap, but I don't have a firm release I can confirm at this point in time. The question about data profiling. Data profiling today doesn't work yet. It's not supported yet on Databricks. Again, that is something being looked at for a future release. Yeah, sorry, there's a few more questions coming in here. For Snowflake. Snowflake, I don't think we support Snowflake as of now as a connector on the Databricks platform. So we looked at the supported connections earlier on in the slide deck, and Snowflake is not one of them yet. It's talking about token expiration as well. So when you create a token on the Databricks side, there is they expire after a number of days. So does it mean that we need to recreate the CCO when refreshing? You don't need to necessarily recreate the CCO because you can just provide the new token ID as you are refreshing. I think we've gone through all the questions that have just been posted. Unless anything else comes in the last second, we will conclude this webinar now. Thanks all for your time. I hope it has been useful. Obviously, if you have any follow-up questions or any problems working with Databricks, please reach out to the Global Customer Support team. As we said before, this webinar will be posted out. The recording will be posted out on YouTube and on our Success portal. So thank you for your time. And one last question. Any limitations in terms of the transformations? Yes, we do not support all transformations. You can refer to the documentation on that one. I didn't manage to include that in the slide deck, but if you refer to the documentation, there is a list of transformations that are supported as of now.